Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And there's still time to win one of our merch bundles signed by Alastair and me if you switch energy suppliers to Fuse by the end of January.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics to sign up. And merch on no merch, it is worth considering switching to Fuse. They're a green electricity supplier generating power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables.
Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money, even though the price cap has gone up. And their customer service is excellent. Fuse offer 24/7 support and promise they'll answer any query within a minute on the Fuse app.
So download it now, use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for terms and conditions and to learn all you need to know.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
And Alastair, I guess we're going to start with Trump, obviously, and then we're going to move on to talk about Hamas, the ceasefire, Israel and Gaza, and then we're going to talk about the tragedy in Southport and the British government's response. But can we start with Trump?
I think we have to start with Trump. I mean, it was just, I was thinking, when he first came in, do you remember what the big story was in the first 24 hours? It was a row about how many people he claimed were at the inauguration. Today, he has announced, I mean, it really is sort of shock and awe, even though we knew that they were better organized, we knew that they had this sort of Project 2025 plan ready to roll. I think the speed with which he's pushing some of this stuff out is borderline terrifying. And of course, that's what he wants. He wants it to be borderline terrifying. But it feels very, very different in so many ways to his first term.
Well, let's just quickly summarize for people who didn't have a full chance to watch the inaugural what he said. So firstly, it's presented as, of course, Trump's second inaugural. And that's a great phrase in the United States because the second inaugurals of Abraham Lincoln, of FDR, of Woodrow Wilson were these incredible events. I think it's the Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural where he does this with malice towards none, with charity for all. Great speech.
There was very little of that yesterday, I have to say, Rory.
Yeah, so Trump's second inaugural, I'll just quickly run through the headlines of it and then give us your sense of how it worked as a speech. So he immediately announced on immigration a national emergency on the southern border. On climate, he was going to drill, baby, drill. On protectionism, he was going to set up External Revenue Service with big tariffs. And he announced that there were going to be henceforth only two genders. In terms of American foreign policy, he says we're going to be judged not just by the wars we end, but the wars we never get into. So that's a hint of a new philosophy of extreme isolationism. He said that he was going to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And he said he was going to take back the Panama Canal, send astronauts to Mars. America was going to be respected again, and somewhat, I think, to the surprise of most international listeners, he announced that the United States would be a free, sovereign, and independent country. Anyway, over to you on the general sense of watching this thing live.
Well, several times during the day, as I was sitting there getting ever more, I don't even know what the word was, but slumping deeper and deeper into a gloom to think this is happening. Fiona kept coming in and saying, "Why do you keep self-harming like this?" But I felt one had to watch it. And you've got the right highlights in terms of the speech. But then, of course, he went on to sign all these executive orders. So when you mentioned Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, I cannot imagine Abraham Lincoln in a sort of what looked like a boxing ring with a presidential desk in the center of the ring and a pen and executive orders, signing executive orders and getting these enormous cheers from a crowd of 20,000.
So sorry, Alice, just explain. So when he says in the speech, I'm going to sign an executive order, he then physically does it in front of the audience.
He then he made the speech,
yeah.
and just to give you the sense of that, so there he is. It wasn't outside, apparently because of the extreme cold weather, but I couldn't help noticing the sun was shining most of the day.
Sorry, just your joke there, presumably, is that given that he was so upset last time that there wasn't a big enough crowd. Almost certainly he decided to manage expectations around the crowd by moving it inside.
I don't know, but I mean that is what lots of people were speculating. Although there were thousands and thousands of people who were heading towards Washington DC to take part, and I thought there was something very symbolic about the fact that the red hat, MAGA hat people out there, Trump's our man, they were cut out from this in terms of they couldn't actually take part at all, and there in the rotunda, pride of place to the tech oligarchs, Musk, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, who looked like a hostage, the guy from Google, and they had better seats than the cabinet. They were alongside the sort of big donors. Milley and Maloney were kind of hovering in the background. But then, of course, right behind him are the former presidents. Biden, Clinton, Hillary Clinton, George and Laura Bush, Obama without Michelle. They're all lined up there. And the speech basically was, if you're Joe Biden, you're sitting there having to smile your way through this guy absolutely destroying your record, your values, your policies, everything. And then, of course, we announced all these orders, and then he went off to do these various events. He went off the next stage, which was a really wild, one of his weaving speeches to party supporters. J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson were behind him, and even they at times were starting to go, whoa, where is this going? Then he goes off, there's other events, then he gets into this event at the Capitol Arena, and he's on a desk there. And so he's got a White House official bringing him presidential folders with the presidential seal, and he's doing that big Donald Trump signature. And they're going wild. So you said, for example, he mentioned in the speech, drill, baby, drill. He then signs, we're coming out of the Paris Climate Agreement again. We're coming out of the World Health Organization. And they're sacking people who they believe he's sacking by social media, including people like Mark Milley and anybody who's got sort of federal positions. They're all going if they're considered to be disloyal. And it's being cheered like a goal at a football match.
What's interesting there is I was following very closely the American reporters, and particularly the New York Times, that was writing a live updated blog on the executive orders that they were predicting that he would sign. And it sounds to me as though they hadn't quite managed to anticipate, with all their contacts and all their discussions, quite the scale of this, because they'd got to the fact that he was going to do something on the southern border to halt illegal entry. They'd got that he was probably going to allow more drilling, but they hadn't quite got to the scale of what you're talking about there. No. So this stuff was, he kept this in his back pocket, so that he was surprising people, right?
Yeah, and certainly in the volume. Although actually, they've been saying for days, there's going to be a huge volume of stuff.
Yeah.
So he does the ones in the arena, does a speech, then he goes back to the White House, and the Resolute desk is there, covered in folders. And the same official who's come back with him presented him with these folders. And he's now doing this whilst doing this, I've been involved in these, where they call them a pool spray at the top. You bring the press in while you're kind of busy doing stuff. So he's sitting at the desk signing things while taking questions about all sorts of things, Ukraine and what have you. You've mentioned the ones on the emergency declaration at the border. And be clear what that means. That means he now has the power to use the military and the National Guard down there. He has the power now to unlock federal funding for the war. Cutting off birthright citizenship.
Quickly on birthright citizenship to explain to people. So that means that at the moment in the United States, if you're born in the United States, even if your parent is an illegal, you become an American citizen, and he's stopped that now.
Correct. That is one of the first that will end up in the courts. That is already, the civil liberties organisations are already saying that one's going to the courts. But the pardon to the January 6th rioters, or the hostages, as he calls them, and what I thought was extraordinary about the event in the Rotunda, and this barely came through any of the commentary, I kept thinking, is somebody going to point out that this is the very part of the Capitol that those rioters on January the 6th were looting and beating up police officers and so forth. So what you had was the Trump enjoying the pomp and the ceremony without any sense of that historical context of literally just 4 years ago. So he's basically pardoned all of them. Some of them, a small number of the really, really serious ones, they will have an offence against their record, but they'll nonetheless going to be let out. Now, in the speech that you saw and that you referred to at the top, he talked about how his entire administration will be governed by the rule of law. I mean, it's hard to think. We know that he's a convicted felon. It's hard to think of something that undermines the rule of law more than something where one of the biggest investigations in American history led to considerable numbers of people going to jail for serious offences, and he now says they're pardoned.
And I think this pardon thing is now emerging as one of the real weaknesses in the entire American constitutional setup.
Oh, yeah. And Biden pardoned family members in advance yesterday.
Exactly. And as we've pointed out, there is basically no equivalent in somewhere like Britain. I mean, theoretically, there's a royal pardon, and it was used, for example, after his death to pardon Alan Turing, who'd been convicted of homosexual offences. But the fundamental separation between the legal system and the executive, this kind of rule of law idea that nobody's above the law, is really under threat here because you had, as you said, Biden pardoning his son. You also had this extraordinary final moment from Biden where he preemptively pardoned General Milley, Fauci, Liz Cheney. And this that wasn't really much for precedent for before. He's basically said, I'm going to issue a pardon without knowing what they're charged with. It's a preemptive pardon so that Trump can't then come and convict them. And some of the Democrats who were pardoned actually challenged this. Some of the elected Democrats on the committee said, excuse me, we don't want to be pardoned and we don't approve. Biden's defense of this preemptive pardons is he's saying it's not that he thinks that they'd be put in jail. He wants to save them from the cost of having to defend themselves. But I think certainly many, many people within Biden's entourage do believe that these people could be arrested and could be sent to jail and don't trust the judicial system. And I suspect the reason that Biden is putting the emphasis on the costs is he's trying to re-emphasize how much he thinks they're innocent, rather than that he completely believes the justice system under Trump can be relied on.
That can only be out of a fear, and I wonder whether this relates to Fauci and Liz Cheney and the others as well, that they heard something was coming. I don't know.
This I've heard. I mean, so Reid Hoffman, who we interviewed, and I think we've got quite a lot of this coming from your friend, the Mooch.
Yeah.
My friend too, but more your friend, the Mooch. You knew him well before me, but he's been pointing out for a long time this list. And obviously, Milley, Fauci, Liz Cheney are right there up on the list of the people that Trump's in. And Trump, of course, has repeatedly said that he was going to go after it. And I think in the speech that you watched, there was this amazing thing saying the weaponization of the Justice Department will end. And he's going to get rid of a radical and corrupt establishment. This is Trump's words, which has extracted wealth and power from our citizens.
That's what we call gaslighting, by the way.
Gaslighting.
Because that is exactly what he's going to do.
A very, very strong Trump determination to do this. But the thing I guess I'm getting at slightly long-windedly is that if the democratic system in the United States was functioning, you would trust the legal system and say, well, in the end, this is for the courts, it's for the judges, it's for the jury. It's not for one president to say, you're going to jail, and another president to say, no, you can't go to jail because I've just issued a pardon. It's not up to presidents who go to jail, or shouldn't be.
This is why so much has been said by people like Madeleine Albright, by people like Tim Snyder, who we interviewed on Leading not long ago, that this is a sort of precursor to genuine authoritarianism. It's why Orban is such a big deal in America, that we talked about that before, it's why he does have this sort of huge admiration for people like Putin and Xi Jinping. And this came through yesterday because Trump was even doing this thing where he was saying, he and Melania walked down with Joe and Jill Biden to the helicopter to take them off and take them to where they're going in Marine One. It's the last time they'll use the presidential helicopter, etc. And it's a nice custom, and it's nice that the incoming guy can do that. And I'm thinking, is nobody even going to point out that he didn't do any of that when he lost, that he didn't turn up for the inauguration, that he left the White House before Joe Biden arrived, and that he consistently refused to recognize or accept that he's lost the election. And of course, these clearances, these pardons of the January the 6th rioters, that's all about saying he didn't lose the election. That is now sort of so embedded in the narrative. And of course, the worst thing from Biden's legacy perspective is that, the legacy, whether he likes it or not, in history is a one-term president. Ultimately, the presidency has gone back to Donald Trump. And he did lots and lots of good things as president, but people do remember these last-minute pardons. They remember it with previous presidents, but he has done a lot of them.
Just maybe move for a second on to what we're beginning to see about who Trump is and what the world is going to have to deal with. So I guess the first big fact that we've learned about Trump is maybe not a new one, which is that it's very difficult to know when he's going to follow through on what he said he'd do and when he wouldn't. So he had said that he was going to end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. He's now decided that it's going to take a few months. So that might make you think, oh, well, you don't really need to take too seriously what he says because he'll just flip. But then you look at the executive orders, and many of those are, of course, exactly what he said he'd do. He said he would pardon the January 6th rioters. He said that he would declare an emergency on the border. He said that he'd revoke the electrical vehicle mandate. That is an interesting one, too, that maybe is worth digging into a bit. Basically, in order to get the American electric vehicle industry off the ground, Biden had quite generous subsidies for people buying electric cars. And Trump has revoked this, but presumably, it'd be interesting, maybe a listener can explain what that means for Musk, who, of course, is the largest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world, who presumably was benefiting from people getting subsidies to buy electric vehicles. But just on that one for a second, how would you describe this type of person? Because I guess the routine that we had when he was in last time is he wakes up at some strange time in the morning, he watches Fox News, he goes on Twitter, he issues some radical statement. He then, during the day, his staff come in and they argue with him. And in some cases, they row him back or they don't. And then the next morning, he wakes up again and again does something very unpredictable and peculiar, which they then try to row back. What do you think this means for how government works? What would it be like working for someone like that?
I think it is going to be very different. Anthony Scaramucci talks a lot about this woman, Susie Wiles, as chief of staff, and seems to think that she's somebody who will be able to keep him more ordered than he was first time around. You can't deny that what he's done in the last 24 hours does link back both to what he said during the campaign and a lot of the arguments in this Project 2025 agenda that we talked about before. So when you look, for example, at the nominations, there was something absolutely chaotic first time around and people didn't last. And we'll see. I mean, the Mooch was saying he thinks that the defense guy Hesketh will be gone in a year, thinks that Rubio, won't necessarily last the whole term. We shall see. But I think in terms of what it means for working around him, it is what we know. It is basically that you can say anything you want in private, but you cannot criticize him in public. You have to flatter him. You have to accept that he is the most important person in the universe and that everything revolves around him. Now, that makes life quite difficult unless you are able to develop a core team that can be utterly frank. But everything you read about the first term, that is not how he operates. Will he read briefs any more than he didn't do last time? Probably not. The other thing I think we shouldn't underestimate, and this relates to foreign policy and it relates to how other world leaders deal with him and how they describe him and what they say about what he's doing, is the pettiness. So one of these executive orders, it's got next to no, I only saw this because I made the mistake of going onto the White House website to read a lot of it because I wanted to see how these things were framed. And they're in quite legalese language.
Are they quite long? Tell us a little bit about them. Are they short or long? Or?
No, they're quite short. They're pretty short, and they're very short, explanatory. And then, so for example, the one of the pardons, it's literally just a very short explanatory and then a list of names, and then a longer list of the ones that are getting the full pardon. But there's an executive order which is going to strip John Bolton, his former national security advisor, of his security clearance. And here's another one. So there's John Bolton loses security clearance. And here's another one. You remember Hunter Biden, the big story about his laptop and was he involved in kind of all sorts of nefarious activities? There's an executive order taking away the security clearance of the American intelligence officials who believed that this might have been a Russian operation against Joe Biden through his son, Hunter Biden. And then there's another one. This one's interesting. This one isn't an order. It's an order where he's going to seek to overturn. And this is the Biden agreement on the OECD deal on minimum corporate taxation. So these are stuff. And then the energy stuff, you'd say drill, baby, drill. A lot of this is about energy. A lot of it's about immigration. But he is doing what he said he would. And I think what the other thing you saw from yesterday is just the power of the performative element of all this.
Yeah.
I mean, I was reading this morning, I was going through the BBC website, and I thought, okay, I know they've got to cover every single angle, but let me just read you this one because this is mind-blowing. BBC website. Melania Trump appeared at the first ball wearing a gown that had some striking similarities to the one she wore to Trump's first inauguration. Clavicle showing cut, the slit up one leg, geometric detailing on the front. But where last time the detail came in the same vanilla silk crepe as the dress itself, this time with a thick black ribbon-like strip, echoed in a choker-style necklace, as if to underline the occasion with more solidity than perhaps she had first time around. From a distance, the inky squiggle could easily remind viewers of the signature that Melania's husband today signed on executive orders. The First Lady's black and white look was echoed in the classic tux worn by her husband. Will we see more oval-style couples dressing during Trump's second term in a move to signal unity between the pair? I mean, this is mind-blowing.
Okay, so from that to the big picture, then. So I think the first thing is understanding why Trump in 2025 is very different from Trump coming in 2017. One big difference is his team. So when he came in last time, he was trying to bring in far more old establishment figures. So his Secretary of Defense was General Mattis, this great Marine Corps general. He brought in Rex Tillerson, the CEO of the largest company in the world, as his Secretary of State. He had H.R. McMaster as his national security advisor. This time round, it's much more radical team. Compared to Millie, Hesketh, as you've pointed out, is a Fox News star who never achieved senior rank in the military, probably the least qualified defense secretary ever. So that's one big difference. You can no longer do what we tried to do. I remember when he came in, because I was a minister in Theresa May's government, and I remember the National Security Council meetings around it. We were still able to rely, this is the Europeans, in 2017, on the fact that people like General Mattis and Tillerson and H.R. McMaster, we all had relationships with. I mean, these were people like me knew from Iraq and Afghanistan, and you could appeal to their common sense of NATO, and they went out of their way to basically contradict him, disrupt him, slag him off to his fury. So that won't happen again. The second big change is that the world has changed a lot. So as I think we talked about a couple of weeks ago, when he came in 2017, he's facing a world in which Emmanuel Macron is about to be elected, Trudeau's in Canada, Merkel is still in Germany, Theresa May is in Britain, and quite a lot of a relatively kind of centrist world is still in existence. We're now in a very different universe. In the intervening 8 years, the US economy has soared ahead of the European economy. It's much more powerful, right? 50% larger than the European economy. Many of the European leaders are in real trouble. You know, Macron's weak, Schulz is about to go, Trudeau's about to go in Canada, is gone in Canada. So there's less counterbalance. And then the final thing, I guess, is the conflict, which is that in 2017, the Middle East was relatively peaceful, Ukraine was relatively peaceful. We're now in a very, very, very different world in which Russia is advancing in Ukraine, advancing steadily, just before Christmas, advancing about 100 meters a day, and Ukraine was in trouble. Situation where it's very difficult to quite understand how Netanyahu's government is ever going to really allow a proper ceasefire to happen. And in which China's in a different position in relation to Taiwan, India's in a much more powerful position, and that's where I'll finish my long, silly lecture. The key things underlying these executive orders show a really fundamental worldview is emerging. It's protectionist, not free trade. It's isolationist. Instead of trying to get involved in other countries, had a phrase in his second inaugural where he said, instead of America spending unlimited money protecting foreign borders, we're going to protect our own borders. It's absolutely anti any conversation about climate change or energy transition. And I guess, above all, it's pushing the rest of the world to be much more transactional. So if you're Britain or France or Germany or an African country, let's say you're Uganda, you're looking now to think, all I can do is defend my national interest, look for transactional deals that I can do with Trump, and almost certainly new blocks are going to emerge into the vacuum that he's creating. Back over to you.
Yeah, I was talking the other day to Kevin McCarthy, the former speaker, who you'd have thought would have ended up as a bit of an enemy of Trump because he basically lost his job as part of all that kind of MAGA infighting. But he seems to be still reasonably close to him. But I was saying to him, which of the leaders last time around do you think handled Trump best? And he said, oh, no doubt the Japanese guy. He really improved his golf. And he was serious. He went and had Abe went and had golf lessons. So, the best thing I can do is really get my handicap down, play with Trump. Obviously, make sure Trump wins. But so, and I think for Britain, Keir Starmer did a sort of short statement from Downing Street, congratulating Donald Trump, welcoming him, work with him, blah blah blah. David Lammy was on the airwaves talking up his charmingness as a host when they had dinner and before the election, and his sort of love of Britain, etc. But the fact is, I worry in that sort of foreign policy mindset that you've just set out. I do worry that here we are, Britain, for all our historical strengths, we are kind of bobbing around in the sea at the moment. China's over there, Europe's over there, America's over there, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for the UK, I think, to deal with this.
Michael Ignatieff wrote quite an interesting article in the FT, and we've interviewed him on Leading if people want to pick up on him. But what he was really focusing on is that there seems to be a hint, more than a hint, that Trump basically is trying to create a empire focused on the Americas. That's why he's talking about Canada as a 51st state. That's why he's talking about the Panama Canal, and to some extent why he's talking about Greenland. And what Michael reads in that is not that America is necessarily going to invade Canada. It's more that Trump will do his best to make Canada even more economically dependent on the United States and impose ever more aggressive terms against his neighbors. And that the Trump doctrine feels like he's saying, my sphere of influence is the Americas. China's sphere of influence can be its neighbors. Russia's sphere of influence can be Europe. And I'm going to give up on all the ideas that liberals really had since the Second World War, that it makes sense to try to talk about any kind of global order. He's hunkering down. And he's saying, we've got the oil, we've got the gas, we've got the rare minerals and resources, particularly if we bring in Canada and Greenland to help us. And really, we just put up the walls and we don't need to worry about the rest of the world. We're sort of a planet apart.
Given there have been all these fears about what his mindset is and his attitude is towards NATO, I don't recall hearing him mention NATO. Now, you could say that's a good thing, in that he wasn't saying I'm coming out of NATO like he is with the WHO and the Paris Climate Agreement. I think my final point, Rory, before we go to a break and then come back and talk about Gaza and Southport, the Mooch, again to quote the Mooch, he said on a podcast a few weeks ago that he felt that there was the danger of the opening for what he called a golden era of corruption. And again, you mentioned Lincoln's second inaugural. Now, I know we didn't have cryptocurrency in the time of Lincoln, but if we did, I cannot imagine either that Lincoln or his wife would launch a meme coin, which would immediately raise millions and millions and millions of dollars. This in a currency that Donald Trump used to say was basically no good for anything apart from fraud and deception. And the other thing that just final, having taken the mickey out of the BBC fashion coverage, if I can close on Melania apparently as part of the deal with the oligarchs has done this £40 million TV deal with Bezos for a documentary. And I noticed that both at the Arlington Cemetery the day before and as she was walking towards the Rotunda, I don't know whether you've ever done a documentary so high budget that they have these cameras that they can sort of move around in the air as they're walking with them. They're like, they're sort of like they weigh like a matchbox or something.
Yeah.
And she had those following her all around. And I noticed that this means she smiled more than she normally does. And it's interesting. I saw Steve Bannon being interviewed. And he said, look, these guys are there and they think they're all powerful. They've got to understand they are there now because he's got them. They are now his little toys. And that's why he's making them look, they're part of the scene. So we'll see. But it was quite a day. It was quite a day.
Well, time for a break.
This episode is brought to you by Saily. Now, I've got a few trips coming up in the next few months. I'm hoping to be in Germany for some time ahead of their election. I will definitely be in France quite soon. And by this point, after travelling all these years, you'd think I had it down to a fine art. Well, I thought that. But then I was introduced to Saily's eSIMs, and my travel has been revolutionised. Changing my SIM is the one thing I always forget. It can be so time-consuming when you're travelling, but it makes such a difference to your trip when you remember. Saily has the answer. It gives you the choice of eSIMs from over 180 different countries, 8 regions, so you'll always have connection when you need it. All you need to do is download an app once, and it will ensure you stay online, save time, and avoid scams. It's easy to install, and listeners of the podcast can get an exclusive discount on Saily's eSIMs by going to saily.com/restispolitics. Welcome back to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
And Rory, you've been deep in Middle East talking. Tell us about it.
So I'm been in discussions with a lot of different players because it's a Chatham House Rules conference. I can't go through the details, the individuals, but we've been right in the middle of talking to Israelis, Americans, Brits about the ceasefire deal. So to remind people of what the deal was, in essence, it's a 3-phase deal. Phase 1, which started on Sunday, is supposed to be the release of 33 Israeli hostages, a release of a number of Palestinians in exchange, humanitarian access, and a ceasefire. Phase 2 is then meant to involve the release of all the remaining live hostages, more returns of Palestinians, and a permanent ceasefire. And then phase 3 is supposed to be the return of deceased hostages and the blockade lifted. So this has begun. And on Sunday, there were these very dramatic scenes of the return, amongst others, of Emily, who's a British hostage who returned with 2 of her fingers cut off. It was a very dramatic scene, partly because the 3 hostages were delivered surrounded by 300 Hamas fighters, very much publicly demonstrating to the world that Hamas still existed and that they were right out there on television, showing that whatever had happened over the last months of bombing, more than a year of bombing, they were still there. And the question now is, what is the end case? And I guess there are 3 scenarios. One of them is that it returns to chaos and conflict. So ceasefire deal breaks down, fighting continues almost indefinitely. Second scenario is an Israeli occupation of Gaza, Israel taking responsibility for security, putting IDF troops permanently in on the ground and trying to run and occupy Gaza. And the third scenario, which is the optimistic but probably unlikely scenario, but it's the one that everybody, of course, is trying to push for, is a permanent ceasefire and the reconstruction of Gaza. And there the devil is in the detail on whether you can possibly imagine what that would look like in a way that works for both Israelis and Palestinians. And the problem, in a nutshell, is that Netanyahu's government certainly would have 2 demands, which would be unacceptable in reality. The first demand is that Israel would have total security control of what was happening in Gaza. They want 100% security. They want an absolute guarantee there can be no return to October the 7th. And that means that they want to be able to continue military operations. They're not going to delegate it to anyone else. And that would not be acceptable on the Palestinian side because there's no way that the Palestinians or the Arab states that are often being talked about as coming in, doing the reconstruction, could be Jordan, Emirates, Egypt, are going to want to be on the ground if Israel is continuing to conduct military operations. And it's going to be very difficult to raise money to reconstruct buildings in Gaza if people think Israel's going to come in and blow them up again. The second condition is the Netanyahu government will demand that there can be 0 participation of Hamas and probably no participation of the PLA. We can get onto that later, but that's partly because they don't trust the PLA, and the Israeli public think the PLA will either fail because they'll be corrupt and useless, or they'll succeed, in which case there'll be a stronger Palestinian state, which is something they don't want either. Whereas on the other side, international observers looking at it think it's almost impossible to imagine anything happening in Gaza without at least some level of consent from Hamas. Hamas may not want to be the government, but Hamas is still an incredibly powerful force on the ground. So if Israel says reconstruction can go ahead, but reconstruction involves continued Israeli military operations and no possible participation of Hamas, then it's almost impossible to imagine anybody, Arab, Palestinian, taking responsibility.
When the deal was announced, although it unleashed an awful lot of kind of joy and hope and expectation, I think an awful lot of people who maybe are close to it and are close to these sorts of situations were not hopeful that we'd get to the end of phase 3 without an awful lot of hiccups along the way. And I think it was during that sort of bizarre executive order signing, press in for a bit of it, session where I think Trump was sort of saying he's not quite sure whether this thing will hold through the 3 phases. I didn't see that bit. I just read something in one of the papers about that. So I think this is going to be very, very difficult. And I think that, the rest is politics. I think the politics of this are a lot tougher for Netanyahu than he is projecting. One of the other orders, by the way, is reversing the sanctions against settlers. Was that part of the deal? Don't know. But I think you've got to worry that the politics that made him so dependent on the hard right in the first place to get into power, to build a coalition, to get through his legal reforms and so forth, that whether he can hold on as long as he seems to think he can without those people being inside the tent rather than outside, because their basic line is, okay, let's get the hostages back. We've got 3 so far. We've got another 30 that are going to come through, hopefully in this first phase. But then we've got to go back to war. Why? Because they say the war aim was to destroy Hamas. And as you say, it was perfectly obvious and it was deliberate. There's no doubt about that. Hamas, and they could have decided, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We won't have any of the media involved until we get to the bit where we hand them over to the Red Cross. And you could have driven a nice car up and they could have stepped out of the car and walked in. Instead of which, it was very deliberate that they showed these Hamas fighters opening the doors, jumping on the car, showing they're very, very visible, very, very present. So I think that was deliberate. The rest of it looked like, it was joyous. It was amazing to see those 3 young women come back. We'll find out as time goes on the extent of the trauma, physical and mental, that they've suffered. But at the same time, you then had alongside it the pictures of Palestinians going, quotes, back to their homes, which was, heartbreaking.
Yeah. Because
they were going back to places which frankly didn't exist anymore. It was just literally sort of masses of rubble.
Yeah.
And I think that the long-term reconstruction plan for Gaza, how much is that going to cost? Where's that going to come from? Is that all going to be about these kind of geopolitical and business deals that get done? So I think phase 1, let's see if that gets through 6 weeks. Phase 2, they then have to work out the timing of that. But I think there's a long way to go before we can be confident this is the end of the war.
So I guess you've put your finger on 3 things. One of them is the politics around Netanyahu. The second is the question of what Hamas is up to. And the third is this question of reconstruction. I mean, on the first, it's very striking how similar Netanyahu is to Trump. Firstly, in his complete elision of the difference between truth, post-truth, non-truth. Secondly, obviously, these corruption allegations. Thirdly, his voter base. He's got this very, very strong voter base, which is strangely often composed of younger, poorer Israelis from non-European backgrounds who see the old European Israeli elite as traitors and corrupt, but who are voting for Netanyahu, who is, of course, a representation of that. I mean, that's another sort of Trump echo. And his allies, of course, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir has resigned, but may well come back in again. Very difficult to put a cigarette paper, it seems, between them in terms of their ideology. I mean, Hamas, of course, and many Palestinians talk about, Palestine must be free from the river to the sea. Smotrich has written a book saying Israel, basically, should occupy an enormous amount of Palestinian territory, and is very clear about the fact that he sees Palestinians effectively as second-class human beings. And Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's deal has been, we'll give you a coalition if you give us war.
Yeah.
And their mindset, and I guess this is the really difficult thing here, to get to peace, the Netanyahu government, and in fact the Israeli public, and part of the question is, would any prime minister make any differences, or is the Israeli public in a state where actually any Israeli prime minister would feel that they had to do this? But anyway, the Netanyahu government, with the support of a lot of the Israeli public, has got to the worldview now that Hamas and many, many Palestinians are completely irreconcilable. There's no possibility of peace. There's no possibility of change. You get senior Israelis saying that this is Arab culture, this is their religion, there's no way of negotiating with them. They're saying that this conflict is not like any other conflict in the world. If you raise Northern Ireland or Cyprus, they say, no. Those things could be resolved by interest. This is purely values-based. And the only way this is going to end is with us killing them. Mm. But the problem is that Israel has so far killed perhaps 19,000 Hamas fighters on their own count, out of the nearly 50,000 that have been killed. And who knows how that counting works, right? But there are about 300,000, I think, Palestinian males under 18, part of a conveyor belt that will come through, presumably, and many of whom will feel that they need to get involved in resistance. Mm. What is the end game? And the end game for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir feels at the moment like perpetual war.
Yeah.
No interest in reconstruction. Back to you.
I saw David Miliband at the weekend, who, as you know, runs the International Rescue Committee. I think one of the themes maybe you could add to your connection of Trump and Netanyahu is this sense of impunity that, you can get away with a lot more in the modern world. And the IRC have produced this really interesting report, which is their emergency watch list. It's the countries that they feel are most in need currently of humanitarian support. And to go back to Tom Fletcher, Tom made the point in our interview that it is harder than ever to be working for a humanitarian organization. And the report that I mentioned, in terms of the numbers that need of humanitarian support right now, are off the scale. Sudan is the country deemed to be most in need, followed by the occupied Palestinian territories. But interesting, this report builds itself around four themes, which I think maybe we should come back to them another time. We have more conflict, but we have less diplomacy. We have far more attacks on civilians, including aid workers, than ever before, but we have fewer consequences for that. We have more carbon emissions affecting these poorer countries disproportionately, but we have less climate crisis action. And we have more wealth accumulation, but we have less poverty alleviation. And I read the report over the weekend. So reading that in the context of then Trump coming in with the agenda that he sets out, which was basically sod more diplomacy, don't worry about, law and so forth, climate crisis, it's a myth, and as for poverty, drill, baby, drill, get richer, get richer, get richer, get more powerful, get more powerful, get more powerful. So it is a tough time, as Tom said, to be a humanitarian.
On this question of whether a deal is possible, and I think one has to keep hoping, and I guess this is presumably the situation that people would have felt that they were in Northern Ireland or South Africa in the 80s. You have to keep hoping and trying to imagine what peace could be. But at the moment, it feels like a zero-sum game because the Israeli government is basically saying, I think almost explicitly, that Israeli security is more important than the rights and the dignity of the Palestinian people. And this push for 100% security effectively leaves no room for risk, no room for autonomy, no room for letting stuff happen in Gaza. And when we think about reconstruction, you usually think about three things. You normally think about governance, economic development, and security. So from the Israeli point of view, security must be done by the IDF. Economic development, they will probably choke off an enormous amount of the border and the imports because they'll be worried that some of the things imported into Gaza could be reused to dig tunnels or fire rockets. Mm. And on the governance side, they're very unlikely to support any form of Palestinian authority, partly because if they had elections, they'd worry that Hamas could win the elections. But even if Hamas didn't win the elections, the whole idea of Palestine, the whole idea of a two-state solution now seems impossible to many Israelis because they see it as a threat to their security. And the threat to the security is an interesting one. I was trying to get my head around this because, of course, what happened on October the 7th was brutal and horrifying. And, of course, Hamas has documents committed to the elimination of the State of Israel. But the question I've been trying to focus on is, what kind of threat really does Hamas actually pose to the continued existence of Israel? So if Israel improved its borders, it had a very, very bad border security with Gaza.
The Israelis that you've been talking to, what do they say in answer to that question?
So what
presumably they say the threat is real and existential, and we people who live here, we underestimate what it's like living there.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of you don't know what it's like having people just 15 kilometers from your border who want to wipe you out. I think there's a middle ground, which is people saying, okay, it's probably true that we've discovered that Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthi are less of a threat than we thought. And it's probably true that Hamas isn't actually in any position to conquer Israel. But even if they're able to do these terrorist attacks again, this is completely unacceptable. That both because it's an unbelievably traumatic to the Israeli people, and also because of what it means for the Israeli economy and stability. But Israel's response to it, or Netanyahu's response to it, is creating a really toxic political atmosphere where the few remaining Israeli liberal critics of what Netanyahu is doing, the few remaining people still talking about the recognition of a Palestinian state, still trying to acknowledge that you probably do ultimately have to work with some parts of Hamas, and that there are more moderate parts of Hamas to work with, civil servants, for example, now for the first time are beginning to feel that they're under pressure to leave Israel. It used to be a great sort of shame to leave Israel. Now there's a sense around Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir and their supporters that they don't want these liberals around. A sort of sense of, well, if you're not prepared to get involved in this perpetual war, you can leave. And you see, this is the first year where the number of people leaving Israel exceeded the number of people moving to it. 85,000 net external migration, and many of those people that Israel doesn't want to be losing. And of course, another point that an Arab friend of mine made is that the risk is that Israel is going to turn from being a liberal democracy into something that will feel more like an Arab state, in which four tribes, the ultra-Orthodox, the religious Zionists, the liberals, and the Arabs within Israel, live in completely separate silos, reading different media with totally different politics, totally different obsessions, and the country becomes increasingly religious, nationalistic, and nuclear armed.
Yeah. Before we turn to Southport, a couple of sentences. Between 2013 and 2023, the number of countries facing attacks on civilians increased by 42% from 33 to 47. Number of countries seeing attacks on hospitals and healthcare workers increased by 57.5% from 40 to 63 between 2016 and 2023. And the number of countries seeing attacks on humanitarian aid workers more than doubled. 136% up.
Can I just finish before we go to Southport with a brief idea of what optimism could look like? Because we're often being criticized for not being optimistic. So the very best case scenario, which the world needs to try to move towards if there's any hope of a lasting ceasefire, is a technocratic administration led by Palestinians, the recognition of a Palestinian state.
Let me jump in. What Israelis are you talking to say about that?
Well, for the people who are close to Netanyahu's government and sympathetic towards it, total rejection.
Right.
So to get there, you would have to have either a new Israeli president, or some people being optimistic say maybe what you get is Trump saying, I can deliver a Saudi-Israeli deal. I can guarantee a lot of money and security guarantees for Saudi and Israel, and in return, you will recognize a Palestinian state, right? So there's two ideas. Either Netanyahu goes, or Trump somehow gets into a very transactional conversation with Netanyahu. In that if, and it's a really big if, you then would try to build an administration which was Palestinian-led, with Hamas not in the government, but consenting to what was happening, and money coming in, potentially from Saudi and the US, and potentially Egypt, Jordan, UAE involved in some of the technocratic bits of the administration. And then you move from the humanitarian assistance into full reconstruction. Now, I'm only saying this because I owe it to the people who are desperately trying to get there. And I think the British government and others would desperately like to get there. Biden and Blinken desperately wanted to go there. Blinken had a whole detailed plan around how this was going to happen. But I'm saying it, of course, sadly, very, very doubtful, because I just can't see how that's going to happen, how Hamas is going to allow that to happen, how Israel is going to allow that to happen, or why internationals would want to get involved when either Hamas or Israel can disrupt and upturn the apple cart at any moment and destroy all the investment they've put in.
Yeah. So you said you were going to be optimistic and ended up being pessimistic about your optimism. which is kind of sums it up. Now, look, finally, let's just talk a little bit about Southport. So Axel Radicabana, the young man who's now pleaded guilty to the murder of these three young girls, Elisa, Alice and Bebe, in Southport. He entered a not guilty plea first time round. Yesterday, I think a lot of people were taken by surprise. He entered a guilty plea. He'll be sentenced on Thursday. And Keir Starmer has immediately announced a full public inquiry. The reasons, I think, driving that, other than the absolute horror and that led to the riots that we talked about a lot at the time, is the fact that I think we're looking at yet another of these failures of the state situations, in that this young man was known to virtually every aspect of the services of the state that relate to young people and the problems that they might be causing to themselves and, more importantly, to others. So kicked out of school for possession of a knife, mental health services aware of his obsession with violence, police aware, social services aware, and 3 times reported to Prevent, the counter-terrorism body. Now, Keir Starmer was given a pretty hard time. I caught the end of his part of his press conference after he made this very long statement about why he felt there was a need for an inquiry. He continued to say they didn't need the similar national inquiry in relation to the rape gangs and the grooming gangs that we talked about before, because he felt that could be done locally. But there was such an interest in what led to this, or if you like, what led to this not being prevented. And I think a lot of it in the end it reminded me a little bit of, I don't know if you remember, one of the things that sort of catapulted Tony Blair to political fame, for want of a better word, was his response as Shadow Home Secretary to the murder of James Bulger, a young boy who was murdered by 2 kids in Liverpool and in Merseyside. And what Keir Starmer essentially was saying is, this is about more than this case. This is about what we expect from the state. This is about young people and how they develop. It is about community and integration and so forth. And also, if you remember that the hate that Elon Musk has towards Keir Starmer seemed really to be fired by what happened in Southport. He was also very clear that he felt that a lot of this was about what young people are consuming on social media. He talked about the access to videos of violence that you get again and again and again, many of which never get taken down. So he basically was saying this is a failure of the state. We've got to look at every aspect of what went wrong. And he was essentially saying, as often is said when these inquiries are set up, they've got to look everywhere, and whatever they come up with, provided it's not crazy, we've got to do it.
Is this a sort of UK equivalent to these American school shootings? I mean, when you describe him, he's consuming sort of weird propaganda and violence stuff, and he's into Hitler and Genghis Khan, and he threatens people. I mean, it feels like the sort of backstory of these horrible cases that happened so much in the US. I mean, hundreds of them, of young men of about that age going in and pulling out their guns and just shooting lots of people.
Well, of course, he'd been expelled from school, and it turned out that prior to this, he had been, one of his previous thoughts was that he was going to go and do this at his old school. So I guess there will be those kind of comparisons. I mean, I think it's very hard to talk about this without knowing all of the kind of facts, and that presumably will now emerge. People were expecting it all to emerge during the trial, but of course now the trial is going to go straight to sentencing.
But from a public policy point of view, I'm just sort of trying to think about this as somebody who was the minister responsible for not just prison, but sort of probation and trying to manage these kinds of risks. I guess that in the US, the conclusion from many people has been that it's very, very difficult to fully anticipate and stop these things, and that the biggest problem in the US is people have access to guns.
Yep.
And that if they didn't have guns, they wouldn't be able to kill so many people. I mean, I agree, it sounds like a lot of things got dropped in this case, but I guess in the US examples, often you don't really find out until after the event. That's when you get onto their hard drives and into their libraries and the stories start emerging. And I suppose another problem for the state may be that, I don't know whether this is true, but what if there were thousands of young men who have extremely unpleasant, violent fantasies and get into Hitler and Genghis Khan, and how does one deal with them? And what sort of protections are people suggesting could have been put around him? Are they suggesting he should have been arrested, tailed? I mean, what practically do you do to stop this?
And of course, what will happen, particularly now in the context of a public inquiry, is that how this situation has ended is what will then cast a light on everything that happened before that. And as you say, are we saying that every time we think somebody might be becoming obsessed with violence, might have harmful designs upon other people, that somehow they have to be locked up, they have to be hospitalized, they have to be given, and then you're into the capacity of the state to do that kind of thing anyway. So I think this is going to be a really big moment. Obviously, there's a politics attached to this as well, because if you remember at the time, Nigel Farage was saying there's a cover-up, that they know more than they're saying. Well, of course, they probably did. However, they were being governed by laws of contempt, and I think this is where the sort of pace of modern media and the pace of modern change does make life so much more difficult for people who are actually tackling law enforcement at the front line.
And it also connects to something which is very much about our politics, which is we want to be in a 100% security, zero risk environment.
Yeah.
And of course, in practice, government is, because of limited resources, because of many things, are perpetually making decisions. You know, when I was prisons minister, we were perpetually releasing people from jail who'd done horrendous offences and taking the risk that they might offend again. We couldn't keep them.
Yeah.
We didn't keep them locked up for their whole lives. And if we're moving into an environment in which the public really wants 100% security, no risk at all, that has huge impacts on many, many things, on basic idea of liberty, freedoms, the amount of surveillance the state puts around you, the way that prison works, the way that sentences work. I mean, everything becomes challenged. And actually, that there is a sort of slight echo of that, isn't there, in the conversation about whether one's going to try to take the risk of allowing a Palestinian administration to reemerge again in Gaza.
Yeah. So that was a fairly gloomy episode, Rory.
I'm afraid it was a pretty gloomy episode. But I'd also want to pay tribute to just how impressive the people are who are still trying to push for peace in Gaza. And I think they're completely right to do so. It's all very well for people like me to sit there and point out that it's all impossible and there are 58 problems. Their response to that is, well, we've got to do something. And at least they're still pushing.
Yeah, we've got to keep doing that. See you soon.
Bye-bye.